Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this underlying expectation of absolute precision. It's kind of like engineering. You fall off a ladder, you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged, undeniable white line in the bone, and the doctor just points at the film and says, well, there it is. That's the problem.
Right, yeah. It's very binary. It's totally objective.
Exactly. Broken or not broken. It's this clean, clinical reality.
And I mean, it's comforting in a way. We like things to be visible, to be perfectly categorized. It gives us a sense of control over the chaos of the physical world.
Oh, totally. But then you step into the world of, like, neurodevelopment or complex trauma
Yeah.
or maybe autoimmune disorders, and suddenly that pristine x-ray machine is just utterly useless.
Yeah.
You're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky, relying on intersecting symptoms, environmental factors, and historical patterns.
Yeah.
But wait, actually, let me reframe that whole thought, because today we aren't looking at medical scans at all.
Not even a little bit.
Right. We're looking at a completely different kind of diagnostic landscape for you today. So picture this. You are sitting at this massive oak desk. On the left side of this desk, you have an ancient weathered scroll, the Book of Revelation.
Yeah, penned nearly 2 millennia ago on the penal colony island of Patmos.
Exactly, by a guy named John. And it is absolutely overflowing with apocalyptic visions. We're talking multi-headed beasts rising from the sea, catastrophic plagues turning rivers to blood, stars falling from the sky, and this terrifying, inescapable global empire. And you expect that kind of vocabulary from antiquity. You expect chariots, you expect broadswords, you expect oil lamps and rudimentary siege warfare.
Right, you expect a world where geopolitical power is measured exclusively by the sheer number of infantrymen you can put in a field and how much grain you have stored up to feed them.
Yes, exactly. But then on the right side of your desk, you place a massive stack of highly technical, entirely unclassified Pentagon white papers.
Huh.
Global security analyses, geopolitical forecasts from the year 2024 and beyond. We're talking dense, peer-reviewed papers detailing hypersonic glide vehicles, quantum submarine detection, specific cyber vulnerabilities of nuclear command and control networks, and the exponential, frankly terrifying, rise of artificial intelligence.
It's quite the contrast.
It really is. And here is the absolute shocker that we are unpacking today. Suddenly, when you put these two stacks next to each other, that ancient vocabulary doesn't feel so ancient anymore. The prophetic poetry of the first century and the highly technical, sterile language of modern military architecture start sharing the exact same descriptive space.
It's wild to see the overlap.
It's mind-bending. So, welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to tear into this massive, contrasting stack of sources you've provided. We're ranging from those military strategy papers to deep theological commentaries and academic journals. We're exploring a genuinely crazy question. What kind of theoretical, military, and technological power would a global entity actually need to possess to be regarded as the beast of Revelation today?
And before we wade into these deep and frankly very intense waters, I really want to establish some crystal clear ground rules for you, the listener. Because of the nature of the sources you've provided, we are inevitably going to discuss highly politically charged topics, globalist institutions, and specific theological frameworks, what theologians call eschatology.
Right, the study of the end times.
Exactly. And our goal here is absolutely not to take a side. We are not here to endorse a specific religious worldview, nor are we here to validate any particular political ideology, push an agenda, or entertain conspiracy theories as objective fact.
Yeah, we're just reading the blueprints.
Right. Our entire focus is analytical. We are looking at this through the lens of a thought experiment. We are synthesizing the source material to show you how the explicit vulnerabilities of our modern digital and military age map incredibly well onto historical interpretations of these ancient apocalyptic systems. We're looking at the mechanics of absolute power.
I love that framing. We are basically architects looking at blueprints today. But to understand the blueprints of this beast system, we first have to understand the language the architect is speaking. So the sources you provided outline 5 primary systems or lenses that people have historically used to interpret the book of Revelation. Because if you don't know the lens, you can't see the picture clearly. Let's start with the first one, which is preterism. Walk us through that.
Sure. So preterism is derived from the Latin word praeter, which literally translates to past. This view holds that the sweeping prophecies of Revelation were largely, if not entirely, fulfilled in the first century. So if you are reading the text through a preterist lens, the beast isn't some science fiction AI overlord or a future global dictator.
It's something that already happened.
Exactly. The beast was the pagan Roman Empire, and specifically the Emperor Nero, who violently persecuted the early church.
So when John is writing about stars falling and massive destruction, the preterist says, well, he's not talking about a future nuclear war. He's talking about the Roman legions.
Correct. They map the apocalyptic language, which they view as highly stylized Jewish apocalyptic genre writing, not literal scientific description, by the way. They map that to the localized destruction of Jerusalem and the Second Temple
Okay.
by the Roman general Titus in 70 AD.
Right, which was just devastating.
It was horrific. The historian Josephus documented this siege and the sheer brutality, the starvation, the mass crucifixions. I mean, it was, for the Jewish people and early Christians, literally the end of their world as they knew it.
Okay, so for them, the apocalypse is essentially in the rearview mirror. But wait, I got a problem with that. If everything happened in 70 AD, what about the return of Christ? What about the resurrection of the dead?
That brings up a really critical distinction highlighted in the theological sources. And that's the difference between mild or partial preterism and full preterism. Mild preterism, which was championed by renowned scholars like the late R.C. Sproul, argues that most of the prophecies, the tribulation, the Antichrist, the destruction of the harlot city, were fulfilled in 70 AD.
But not all of them.
Right. They maintain that the bodily second coming of Christ and the final resurrection are still future events.
Okay, that makes more sense. What about the full preterists?
Full preterism takes the premise to its absolute extreme. They claim that everything, including the second coming and the final judgment, already happened spiritually in the first century. And it's really worth noting that the sources emphasize full preterism is universally considered heretical by Orthodox Christian standards.
Because it completely denies a future physical return of Christ.
Exactly, which is a cornerstone of the historic creeds.
That makes sense. But why would someone adopt this view in the first place? It feels almost counterintuitive to read these epic, globe-shaking descriptions of boiling oceans and demonic locusts and just wave it off as, oh, that was just a first-century Roman siege.
Well, the sources outline a couple of primary motivations. One is purely apologetic, answering critics. Skeptical philosophers like Bertrand Russell famously pointed out that Jesus said he would return soon and that the generation listening to him wouldn't pass away before these things took place.
Right, so if it didn't happen, the skeptic says it's a failed prophecy.
Exactly. Preterists counter this by saying, well, he wasn't wrong. He did return soon, just in a spiritual judgment upon Jerusalem through the Roman armies. But the second, perhaps more influential motivation is tied to a movement called Christian Reconstructionism or dominion theology.
Okay, unpack that. How does your view of the end of the world affect your politics today?
Massively. Just think about it. If you believe the book of Revelation is predicting a future time of unparalleled, unavoidable global tribulation, where an invincible evil empire takes over and slaughters believers.
Yeah, that naturally fosters a deeply pessimistic view of the immediate future.
Exactly. It often makes people retreat. I mean, why polish the brass on a sinking ship?
That's the point.
But if you believe all that terrible apocalyptic stuff is safely locked in the past, it clears the runway, it fosters an incredibly optimistic view where believers are mandated to progressively conquer the world's institutions. Law, media, government, education. They want to conquer those for Christianity over thousands of years until the world is basically a utopia, at which point Christ returns.
Wow, so eschatology isn't just about guessing the future. It's literally an operating system for how you engage with the present.
Okay.
So that's the past lens. What's the second framework?
The second is historicism. This framework views Revelation not as a single clustered event in the past, nor a clustered event in the future, but as a continuous, unfolding chronological timeline of Christian history, stretching from the days of the Apostle John all the way to the Second Coming.
So they are basically reading the newspaper with the Bible open on the table, trying to match up current events to chapter 8 or chapter 9.
Exactly. And this was actually the dominant view during the Protestant Reformation. Historicists, including heavyweights like Martin Luther, John Calvin, John Wycliffe, and even scientists like Isaac Newton, they famously utilized something called the year-day principle.
The year-day principle. What's that?
They took passages from Ezekiel and Numbers where a day represented a year and applied it to Revelation. So when Revelation mentions a period of 1,260 days, the historicist interprets that as 1,260 years.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and using this mathematical formula, the reformers mapped the rise of the papacy and the institutional Roman Catholic Church directly to the beast of Revelation. They looked at the corruption, the political power, and the persecution of dissidents during the medieval church era and saw it as the literal fulfillment of the Antichrist system.
Okay, but I see a glaring issue with that.
Yeah.
If you're doing math to figure out when the 1260 years ends and the year comes and goes and the world keeps spinning, what do you do?
That is precisely the major weakness the sources point out. Historicism requires constant revision. When your timeline expires, you just have to go back and recalculate your starting date. Furthermore, the sources criticize it for being hyper-Eurocentric.
Aiming it only looks at Europe.
Right. It reads the entire cosmic plan of God exclusively through the lens of Western European church history, completely ignoring what might be happening in Asia, Africa, or the Americas.
Got it. Past, continuous present. So what about the future?
That brings us to futurism. This is the lens that most modern people are vaguely familiar with, even if they don't know the term, because it's deeply embedded in modern evangelicalism and pop culture. Think of the Left Behind book series or massive blockbuster movies.
Oh, yeah, totally. The rapture, the barcodes, all of that.
Exactly. Futurists believe that the vast majority of revelations, specifically chapters 4 through 19, describe events that are entirely in the future. They approach the text with a highly literal hermeneutic.
So they take it at face value.
They do. When the text says a global dictator will arise, require a physical mark on the hand or forehead to buy or sell, and wage a devastating war during a literal 7-year period called the tribulation, futurists expect exactly that to happen. They aren't looking for allegories. They are looking for a literal geopolitical global infrastructure.
Okay, that's 3. Past, timeline, future. What are the last 2?
The fourth is idealism. Idealists look at the endless debates of the other 3 camps and basically say, you are all entirely missing the point. They do not look for specific, point-in-time, historical, or future fulfillments.
So what are they looking for?
To an idealist, Revelation is a timeless, highly symbolic allegory about the eternal cosmic struggle between good and evil, between the kingdom of God and the kingdoms of man.
Oh, okay, so the beast isn't a specific person or empire.
Right. The beast isn't Emperor Nero. The beast isn't the Pope. And the beast isn't some future AI overlord in Geneva. The beast is any oppressive, tyrannical, state-worshipping system throughout human history that exalts itself above the divine. It could be Nazi Germany, it could be Stalinist Russia, it could be the Roman Empire.
I really like that framing. It's like looking at a complex piece of abstract art in a gallery. The preterist walks up and says, well, this is a photograph of a specific event in the past. The historicist says, no, this is a timeline of the last 2,000 years. The futurist says, you're both wrong. This is a literal architectural blueprint for tomorrow. And the idealist steps back and says, guys, it's a mood board.
A mood board.
Yeah, like it's capturing the essence of tyranny to encourage persecuted people in any era.
That is a brilliant synthesis, really. And your art gallery analogy leads perfectly to the 5th and final approach, which is the eclectic view. The eclectic approach essentially walks into that gallery and says, actually, all of you have a piece of the truth.
Ah, the best of all worlds.
Exactly. It borrows from all of them. It acknowledges the preterist point that Nero and Rome were historical foundational prototypes of the beast. It acknowledges the idealist point that this spirit of tyranny repeats throughout history. But it aligns with the futurists by saying that these repeating historical patterns are ultimately spiraling toward a final, literal global climax. It synthesizes the historical reality with a future physical culmination.
Okay, so let's plant our flag in that eclectic or futurist view for the sake of our thought experiment today, because that's really where the military sources intersect. If we project this onto the modern era, I have a massive structural question. Go. If the preterist view was just about Rome's military might, which was basically broadswords, wooden shields, and the Pax Romana enforced by guys in sandals, what kind of power is actually required for the futurist concept of a global dictator today? I mean, we don't conquer the globe with infantry anymore.
And this is exactly where the ancient theology and the modern Pentagon white papers collide. The geopolitical sources emphasize a fascinating detail from Revelation 13. The text describes the beast rising from the sea as a composite entity. It says it looks like a leopard, has the feet of a bear, and the mouth of a lion.
Which sounds like a terrifying zoo animal.
It does,
Yeah.
but if you trace biblical imagery back to the book of Daniel, these specific animals represented previous world empires.
Oh, right. Like Babylon and Persia.
Exactly. The lion was the majestic, highly centralized, absolute authority of Babylon. The bear was the massive, crushing, overwhelming military strength of the Medo-Persian Empire. The leopard represented the brilliant, terrifyingly swift expansion and tactical genius of the Grecian Empire under Alexander the Great.
So this final beast system isn't just a new empire, it's an amalgamation. It absorbs the DNA, like the absolute worst, most effective traits of all previous superpowers, and combines them into one apex predator.
Precisely. And the text also mentions it has 10 horns, which eschatologists interpret as a 10-nation confederacy that pools its sovereignty and gives its power to this beast. But to your point about the mechanics of power, in the ancient world, Rome's dominance was purely physical and geographic.
Right, they built physical roads, they marched physical legions across borders, they physically crucified dissenters.
But today, if an entity wants to replicate that level of absolute global dominance, they require a totally different architecture. Because to be a global hegemon today, you have to overcome a hurdle that Rome never had to face. You have to overcome the ultimate military equalizer of the modern era.
You're talking about mutually assured destruction, the nuclear stalemate.
Yes. If a regime wants to truly rule the world today, having a massive standing army is irrelevant if your enemy can just turn your capital city to glass with the push of a button.
Exactly. It doesn't matter how many tanks you have.
Right. So to achieve the absolute invincibility described in the text, you have to break the fundamental mathematics of the nuclear age. You have to render MAD totally obsolete.
Which is an incredible conceptual pivot, and it takes us right into the first major technological pillar of our deep dive today, the death of MAD and the mechanics of modern invincibility. So for anyone who might need a quick refresher on Cold War doctrine, mutually assured destruction, or MAD, was the absolute bedrock of strategic stability in the 20th century.
It really was.
The idea is brutal but simple. If you launch a nuclear strike against me, I am guaranteed to launch a retaliatory strike against you, and our nations will both cease to exist. Therefore, nobody pushes the button. But MAD relies entirely on one concept.
The absolute certainty of a second strike capability.
Yes. You have to be able to survive the first punch long enough and with enough firepower left to throw the knockout counterpunch. But these defense papers we're looking at are arguing that MAD isn't just politically shaky. They are arguing it is becoming mathematically and technically obsolete. How?
Well, it comes down to emerging technologies that compress the timeline of warfare to near zero, while simultaneously neutralizing defensive systems. The sources highlight two massive paradigm-shifting disruptors: hypersonic glide vehicles, or HGVs, and directed energy weapons, or DWs.
Okay, let's start with hypersonics. Why did they break the system?
To understand why they break the system, look at the Cold War baseline. An intercontinental ballistic missile, an ICBM, launched from deep inside Russia would take roughly 30 minutes to reach a target in the United States.
Right.
It flies in a massive, predictable parabolic arc, straight up into the vacuum of space, and then falls back down due to gravity.
Right, the famous 30-minute warning. Which is terrifying, but 30 minutes is a lifetime in military strategy.
Exactly. It gives early warning radars time to detect the launch, leadership time to verify it's not a flock of geese or a computer glitch, the president time to open the football, and command time to launch the retaliatory strike before the incoming missiles land.
So that 30-minute window is the structural foundation of deterrence.
It is. But hypersonic glide vehicles fundamentally shatter that window. Unlike an ICBM, an HGV is launched into the upper atmosphere, but then it detaches from its rocket booster. It doesn't go into space. Instead, it glides and skips along the upper atmosphere at speeds exceeding Mach 5.
5 times the speed of sound. Wow.
Yeah, and this does two things. First, it compresses that 30-minute warning time down to under 5 minutes. Second, and more importantly, they maneuver unpredictably mid-flight.
Wait, pause on that. Why does maneuvering matter so much? If it's going Mach 5, isn't it just a really fast bullet?
It's worse than a fast bullet because of how radar works. When an ICBM launches, radar calculates its trajectory like a quarterback throwing a football. Once it leaves the hand, you know exactly where it will land.
Because of gravity and physics.
Exactly. But an HGV can change its flight path dynamically. Furthermore, traveling at Mach 5 through the atmosphere creates so much friction that it generates a plasma sheath around the vehicle.
A plasma sheath.
Yeah, a bubble of superheated ionized gas. And this plasma actually absorbs radio waves, rendering it essentially invisible to traditional early warning radar systems. You don't know it's coming, and even if you see it briefly, you have no idea what city it's actually targeting until the last few seconds.
So 5 minutes, let's just game that out. In under 5 minutes, a commander has to be woken up, briefed, verify the threat isn't a sensor malfunction, make the heaviest decision in human history, and transmit launch codes. That's a decision space crisis of unimaginable proportions. Humans literally cannot process data that fast.
They cannot. And the invincibility equation gets even more terrifying when you combine offensive hypersonics with defensive directed energy weapons.
Right, the DDW.
Yes. DWs are essentially high-powered lasers.
Yeah.
The defense sources describe a rapidly approaching scenario where a nation develops a comprehensive laser shield. Think about traditional missile defense, things like the Patriot system or the Iron Dome.
Or they shoot a bullet with a bullet.
Exactly. You launch a kinetic interceptor to physically smash into the incoming missile. Those interceptors are incredibly expensive, sometimes costing millions of dollars each, and you only have a limited magazine.
Right, so if I shoot 100 cheap drones at you, and you use a $2 million missile to shoot down each $500 drone, I win just by bankrupting you.
Exactly. It's called cost imposition. But a directed energy weapon operates at the speed of light, and the cost per shot is essentially just the cost of the electricity required to fire the laser. We're talking pennies, assuming you have the power grid to sustain it.
That's a huge shift.
Massive. If a nation can use DWs to instantly vaporize incoming retaliatory missiles, you entirely reverse the economic cost imposition of warfare.
Okay, I see where this is going. Revelation 13.4 poses this famous rhetorical question: who is like the beast? Who can make war with him? And I always read that as, poetic hyperbole, the ancient equivalent of saying our guys are the toughest.
Right.
But let me push on this a bit, because history is a long story of point and counterpoint. Someone invents a better sword, so someone else invents chainmail. Someone invents the machine gun, so someone invents the tank. Why would this specific convergence of technology make a regime permanently invincible rather than just giving them a temporary strategic edge for a decade?
That is the most critical question we can ask. And to answer it, we have to look at a military concept called the OD loop and how artificial intelligence supercharges it.
The OD loop. Tell me about that.
The OD loop was developed by a brilliant military strategist and fighter pilot named John Boyd. He developed it by analyzing why F-86 Sabre pilots in the Korean War were consistently beating superior MiGs. ODS stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act.
Observe, orient, decide, act.
That's Brief, Orient, Decide, Act.
Okay.
In any conflict, from a dogfight to global thermonuclear war, the side that can cycle through their ODA loop faster is the side that wins. You observe the enemy's action, orient your understanding to the new reality, decide on a counter-tactic, and act.
And if you move through that cycle faster than your enemy, you aren't just winning, you're actually creating reality. Your enemy is constantly reacting to where you were a minute ago rather than where you are right now.
Yeah.
They get trapped in a state of confusion.
Yes. Now, project that dynamic onto a global macroeconomic scale using artificial intelligence. If this theoretical beast system uses quantum AI to process global surveillance data instantly and can launch hypersonic strikes that arrive in minutes while cloaked in plasma, while simultaneously operating a directed energy shield that cheaply vaporizes any physical retaliation.
They are cycling through the global ODA loop before an adversary can even orient themselves to the fact that a war has started.
Exactly. Resistance doesn't just become difficult or costly, it becomes mathematically and physically impossible.
Because the moment you decide to strike back, your weapons are destroyed before they even leave the atmosphere, and a hypersonic glide vehicle is already detonating over your command center.
Exactly. If you possess a first strike capability that cannot be tracked or stopped, paired with a defensive shield that cannot be penetrated or exhausted, you have fundamentally broken the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. The apocalyptic perception of invincibility shifts from poetry to stark reality. Who can make war with him? No one. Because the second you formulate the thought to make war, you have already lost.
That is genuinely chilling. But you know what? It's not just about stopping missiles in the air.
Yeah.
If you're really aiming for total domain dominance, it's about stopping those missiles from launching in the first place. You don't wait for the arrow to fly, you break the bowstring, which transitions us from the physical hardware of warfare to the software.
The cyber aspect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We need to talk about the digital nervous system of the military, what the sources refer to as cyber electronic decapitation and nuclear entanglement.
Yeah, to understand this vulnerability, we have to look closely at NC3. That's Nuclear Command, Control, and Communications. This is the intricate architecture of sensors, satellites, relays, and computers that allows a national leader to actually order a nuclear launch.
Right. And historically, this stuff was pretty isolated, right?
Totally. During the Cold War, these systems were largely analog. More importantly, they were air-gapped. This means that they were physically isolated networks, completely disconnected from the broader public internet. You couldn't hack a Soviet silo from a laptop in Nebraska because there was no wire connecting them.
Right. If you wanted to sabotage it, you had to physically infiltrate a spy into the bunker with a pair of wire cutters.
But the relentless drive for modernization has transitioned these legacy networks into the digital age. Modern militaries now rely on complex networks of satellites, fiber optics, and digitized communication hubs. While this dramatically increases operational efficiency and coordination, it massively expands the attack surface.
You're opening the door to cyber warfare on the most destructive weapons humanity has ever built.
Yes, and the defense white papers detail several specific imminent vulnerabilities. The first and most pressing is quantum computing.
Oh, quantum. That's a huge buzzword right now.
It is, but the threat is very real. Currently, nuclear launch codes, secure communications, and banking ledgers rely on classical encryption, specifically algorithms like RSA. These are basically incredibly complex mathematical puzzles, usually involving factoring massive prime numbers that would take a classical binary computer thousands of years of trial and error to crack.
It's like a lock where the combination has a trillion digits.
Exactly. But a mature quantum computer doesn't operate on classical binary bits of ones and zeros. It uses qubits, which can exist in a state of superposition, meaning they can represent multiple possibilities simultaneously.
Which allows them to solve multiple paths at once.
Right. By utilizing something called Shor's algorithm, a quantum computer can solve these massive prime factorization puzzles not in thousands of years, but potentially in hours or minutes. The entity that achieves quantum supremacy first, meaning their quantum computers can outpace classical encryption, effectively holds the master skeleton key to everyone else's digital locks.
So we aren't talking about bombing a silo. We're talking about a scenario where a regime logs into your nuclear network, cracks the encryption, and simply changes your launch codes. You go down to the bunker, turn the physical key, and the computer screen just blinks. Invalid password.
Or, even more catastrophically, they could spoof a command. They could inject authenticated encrypted orders into your network, ordering your own missiles to launch or detonate in their silos.
That's terrifying.
And quantum technology isn't just threatening software, it's threatening the hardware of deterrence. Another massive quantum threat highlighted in the geopolitical sources is the development of quantum squid-eyed sensors.
I saw that acronym in the reading. SQUID-WID. Superconducting Quantum Interference Device. It sounds like something out of a James Bond movie. How does it work?
It's terrifyingly real, and the sources explicitly point out that nations like China are pouring billions into this research. To understand why it matters, think about the U.S. nuclear triad: bombers, land-based silos, and submarines.
Okay.
The U.S. relies most heavily on its Ohio-class stealth submarines for deterrence. They sit silently in the deep, vast, opaque ocean. They are the ultimate hidden retaliatory threat. Even if an enemy destroys every silo in the Midwest and every bombman on the tarmac, those subs are the ghost in the machine that guarantees the attacker will be destroyed.
But submarines rely on acoustic stealth. They're designed to be entirely silent so sonar can't hear them.
Correct, but they were still composed of thousands of tons of steel moving through salt water. A squid sensor utilizes superconducting loops to detect incredibly minute, almost imperceptible changes in local magnetic fields.
Wait, so they aren't listening for them at all?
Not at all. They don't listen for sound. They look for the microscopic magnetic anomaly created by a massive steel hull displacing water.
I'm trying to visualize this. It's like, imagine trying to find a needle in a massive haystack, but instead of using your eyes or hands, you drag an incredibly powerful electromagnet over the pile. The magnet makes the needle vibrate so intensely that the hay around it catches fire. You don't ever need to see the needle. You just follow the smoke of its magnetic footprint.
That is a brilliant analogy. If these quantum squid sensors can be mounted on fleets of underwater drones or low Earth orbit satellites, the vast, opaque ocean suddenly becomes perfectly transparent.
That's a huge paradigm shift.
It is. The ultimate hidden deterrent is instantly visible, targetable, and vulnerable to a coordinated preemptive strike.
Wow. And the concept of using cyber to cause physical destruction isn't just theory, right? The sources bring up Stuxnet as the proof of concept.
Stuxnet is the absolute watershed moment in cyber warfare. Discovered around 2010, it was an incredibly sophisticated, malicious computer worm, widely believed to have been developed jointly by the U.S. and Israel. Its target was the deeply buried, air-gapped Iranian nuclear facility at Natanz.
How do you hack something that isn't connected to the internet?
You bridge the air gap physically. It's believed it was introduced via a simple infected USB flash drive plugged into a worker's laptop, which was then carried into the facility.
Wow. Just a simple USB drive.
Yeah. Once inside, Stuxnet was a masterpiece of sabotage. It specifically targeted the Siemens programmable logic controllers. Those are the tiny computers that physically manage the speed of the uranium enrichment centrifuges. The malware instructed the centrifuges to spin wildly out of control, physically tearing themselves apart.
But didn't the engineers notice?
That's the insidious part. It sent false, pre-recorded diagnostic readouts to the human engineers in the control room, telling them everything was operating perfectly normally.
So the engineers are just drinking coffee, looking at green lights on their monitors, while the machines in the next room are literally shredding themselves to pieces. Stuxnet essentially proved, definitively, that you can achieve kinetic, physical destruction without a single soldier crossing a border or a single bomb being dropped.
Precisely. So, if you are a rising global hegemon, you don't need to risk a nuclear winter by bombing your adversary's silos. You just need to infect their NC3 network with malware that subtly alters targeting coordinates or disables the launch sequence. You decapitate their military digitally.
It's a whole new battlefield.
It is. But the security papers also outline a completely different pathway to disaster, something called the entanglement dilemma.
I found this section of the reading so nerve-wracking.
Yeah.
Explain entanglement.
It comes down to economics and infrastructure. Modern militaries want to be efficient, so they are increasingly integrating their conventional command systems with their nuclear command systems. They share the same early warning satellites, the same fiber optic communication hubs, the same radar arrays. They are physically and digitally entangled.
Okay, so they're all tied together.
Right. Now imagine a conventional, non-nuclear skirmish breaks out over a border dispute. Nation A launches a highly targeted cyber attack meant simply to blind Nation B's conventional radar system, just so they can sneak a few fighter jets in to bomb a bridge.
But because the systems are entangled, Nation B sees their radar go totally dark. They can't see the sky. They don't know it's just a localized hack for a few jets. They assume, oh my God, they are blinding our satellites so they can launch a massive preemptive nuclear strike.
Exactly. It's an accidental algorithmic escalation. The ambiguity of the cyber attack triggers a catastrophic miscalculation.
It's like, imagine you wire your home's regular front doorbell and the self-destruct sequence for your entire house to the exact same electrical circuit breaker to save a few bucks on wiring. One rainy day, a delivery guy rings the bell, it shorts the circuit, and your whole neighborhood is vaporized.
That analogy perfectly captures the systemic fragility of entanglement. And this systemic fragility raises a profound debate within the source material. There is actually a strong contrary view presented by some geopolitical analysts.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Some experts argue that AI and cyber vulnerabilities will not actually undermine nuclear deterrence through preemptive strikes.
After all that, they think the system holds. Why?
Because a preemptive disarming strike against a major nuclear power remains an incredibly, almost unthinkably risky gamble, even if you think you possess quantum supremacy, even if you think your SQUIDent sensors have tracked every single submarine. What if your algorithm is wrong about just one submarine?
Choked one.
If you miss one single Ohio-class sub, it surfaces and unleashes enough firepower to obliterate every major city in your country. The risk of getting your intelligence 99.9% right still results in total national annihilation. The analysts compare it to historical gambles like Pearl Harbor or the Six-Day War. Preemptive strikes are desperate rolls of the dice that rarely result in the clean, total victories the aggressors envision.
Okay, that makes sense. The cost of being wrong is simply too high. So if the real danger isn't a calculated, cold-blooded preemptive strike, what is the actual threat of AI in this space?
The real danger shifts entirely to the doctrine of launch on warning.
Launch on warning.
Because hypersonic weapons compress the reaction timeline to 5 minutes, and cyber attacks create massive ambiguity and a digital fog of war, human beings simply cannot process the incoming data fast enough to make a rational, verified decision. You cannot have a congressional debate in 4 minutes while missiles are falling.
You literally don't have the time.
Therefore, the sheer speed of AI-driven warfare will force nations to adopt automated, dead-hand perimeter systems.
Dead hand. I read about this. It was an old Soviet doomsday system, right?
Yes, the perimeter system. During the Cold War, the Soviets built a semi-automated, failed, deadly network. The logic was, what if the U.S. launches a decapitation strike that wipes out Moscow and the entire Soviet leadership before they can issue launch orders?
They wanted to guarantee a response.
Exactly. To guarantee retaliation, they built a system where if deep sensors detected massive seismic shocks, huge spikes in radiation, and sudden overpressure consistent with nuclear detonations, and simultaneously lost communication links with the high command in Moscow, the system would automatically, without human intervention, launch a cascade of command rockets that would transmit launch codes to every surviving silo in the empire.
The ultimate revenge machine. But you take the human completely out of the loop.
And if we update that Soviet relic for the modern AI age, we are looking at a terrifying scenario. We are moving toward a world where highly complex algorithms, not elected presidents or generals, are deciding whether to launch nuclear weapons based on sensor data that, as we just discussed with Stuxnet, might be spoofed, hacked, or hallucinating.
That is the ultimate loss of human agency. We literally hand the keys to the apocalypse over to the machine. So let's pull back and synthesize this. If a system, let's call it the beast system, achieves this level of military and digital dominance, if they have directed energy shields, hypersonic strike capabilities, quantum decryption, and the ability to hack your infrastructure, they are completely invincible from a nation-state perspective.
Absolutely invincible.
But as I was reading through the eschatological sources, a massive realization hit me. You cannot govern a global civilian population with hypersonic missiles.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, an ICBM solves the problem of rival nations. It solves the problem of a foreign army. But how does this entity control the actual everyday population? You can't point a nuclear warhead at a plumber in Ohio who refuses to pay his taxes or refuses to worship the state. It's the wrong tool for the job.
That's a very good point.
Right. A military secures the borders. But how does this system conquer the mind and the wallet of the individual? This shifts the entire battlefield from physical coercion to psychological and economic control. How does this infrastructure actually function domestically?
That brilliant conceptual pivot takes us directly into the domain of the second entity mentioned in the book of Revelation. The text introduces a figure often called the false prophet, or the second beast, which rises from the
The
earth.
second beast, okay.
While the first beast is primarily a political and military conglomerate, the second beast is entirely religious, ideological, and administrative. Its singular role is to compel the global population to worship and submit to the first beast. And it achieves this through massive deception and what the text specifically calls great signs.
Right, and the white papers draw some absolutely mind-blowing alignments between these ancient magical signs and our current digital capabilities.
They really do.
For example, Revelation 13 explicitly says the false prophet performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. Now, for a first-century reader, that immediately evokes the prophet Elijah calling down literal lightning on Mount Carmel. It sounds like pure magic.
Yeah.
But how did the defense sources read that today?
Today, military strategists interpret fire from heaven through the lens of orbital warfare. It perfectly describes the deployment of those directed energy weapons from low Earth orbit, or kinetic bombardment systems, often referred to theoretically as rods from God.
Rods from God, which is an insane concept.
It is. They drop massive tungsten rods from satellites, hitting the Earth with the force of a tactical nuke, but without the radioactive fallout. To an uninformed, perhaps desperate civilian population, a silent, invisible laser striking from space that suddenly incinerates a rebel stronghold or a dissenting city looks exactly like divine fire from heaven. It provides the technological illusion of godhood.
But the deception goes much deeper than just raw, terrifying displays of power, because fear only gets you so far. Eventually, you need devotion. The text says the false prophet creates an image of the beast and actually gives breath to it, so that the image can speak and demand worship.
Yes.
Historically, commentators thought this meant some sort of mechanical trickery, like a bronze statue with a hidden priest speaking through a brass tube. But the text sources map this to something much more prevalent and powerful today: AI avatars, neural rendering, and deepfakes.
The parallels are astonishing here. Generative AI, utilizing large language models and generative adversarial networks, or GANs, can now create perfectly photorealistic avatars that speak, emote, and interact dynamically.
It's everywhere now.
The sources highlight a very specific real-world example from 2023. In Germany, a massive Protestant church service was conducted entirely by an AI avatar projected on a huge screen above the altar. An artificial intelligence generated the entire sermon, formulated the prayers, and delivered them with perfect inflection. Hundreds of human beings sat in the pews, participated, and worshipped, led entirely by a machine.
Oh.
Now, that was a benign, some gimmicky experiment, but imagine that exact technology scaled up and aggressively weaponized by a global authoritarian regime with unlimited computing power.
You wouldn't need a dictator to travel the world doing rallies. You could have a flawless AI projection of the world leader, interacting with millions of people simultaneously, customized to their exact psychological profile, speaking in their native language flawlessly, in real time. It would be functionally omnipresent. It is an image that breathes and speaks.
And when you introduce deepfake technology, the simulation of reality becomes entirely indistinguishable from actual reality. The geopolitical sources warn heavily about the era of false signs and wonders.
Yeah, deception on a massive scale.
Christians note that Jesus himself warned in Matthew 24 that false Christs and false prophets would perform great signs specifically to deceive, if possible, even the elect. In a highly digital age where we consume reality entirely through screens, a regime could easily stage a counterfeit supernatural event. Security experts envision scenarios where expertly crafted deepfakes combined with orbital holographics and voice cloning technology could simulate a fake divine apparition or even a counterfeit second coming of Christ, entirely deceiving the global masses into submission.
If you look up at the sky and see something with your own two eyes and your phone confirms it and the news confirms it, how do you possibly deny it? It's the ultimate weaponization of human perception. But here's where it gets really intense, because as we know from history, ideological deception only goes so far. You can fool a lot of people, but there will always be dissidents, there will always be holdouts. So eventually, you need a mechanism for absolute enforcement.
And that brings us to Revelation 13.1617.
Exactly. Which introduces arguably the most famous, most fiercely debated element of apocalyptic prophecy in history. The mark of the beast. Let me read it directly. He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name.
This passage is the absolute crux of the beast's domestic infrastructure. It is not primarily a system of physical imprisonment. It is a system of total, inescapable economic exclusion. And the economic sources in our stack link this ancient prophecy directly to the rapid development of CBDCs, biometric identification, and algorithmic social credit scoring.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that because it's vital. Right now, if I want to go down the street and buy a cup of coffee, I can hand the barista a crumpled $5 bill. That transaction is completely anonymous. It is an untraceable peer-to-peer exchange of value between two free individuals. The government has no idea I bought that coffee.
But physical cash is absolute anathema to a system requiring total surveillance and control. That is why the world is rapidly moving towards central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs.
CBDCs. Tell me how those differ from something like Bitcoin.
A CBDC is a digital currency issued and directly controlled by a nation's central bank. Now, we must distinguish this from decentralized cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. Bitcoin utilizes a distributed ledger, so no single entity controls it. A CBDC utilizes a highly centralized ledger. The state has absolute visibility into every single fraction of a cent.
Okay, so total visibility.
But visibility is only half the power. The true danger of a CBDC is that the money is programmable. Because it operates via smart contracts, the government can dictate exactly how, when, and where your money functions.
Give me an example of programmable money. How does that look in daily life?
They can dictate that your digital dollars can only be spent on certain state-approved items, perhaps limiting your meat consumption to meet carbon goals. They can implement geographical fencing, meaning your money literally ceases to function if you travel more than 5 miles from your home. They can even program expiration dates into your salary to force economic stimulus, like spend this by Friday or it disappears from your wallet.
That is terrifying control. But how do you link that digital money to the physical person? Because passwords can be stolen, cards can be shared.
That is where the prophetic alignment becomes jarring. The text specifically mentions the right hand or the forehead. If you want a perfectly secure, closed-loop financial system, you eliminate cards and passwords and rely entirely on biometrics.
Well, right hand or forehead?
We already use Apple Pay with facial recognition. The next logical step, currently being piloted in several countries, is utilizing infrared scanners that read the unique vein patterns in the palm of your right hand, or advanced facial recognition mapping the geometry of your face and forehead. Your physical body becomes your exclusive digital wallet.
So you tie the programmable CBDC to the physical biometric marker. And then you add the final layer of enforcement, the social credit score.
Exactly. Add an AI-driven social credit system similar to the frameworks already being heavily utilized and refined in parts of Asia. AI algorithms continuously scrape your data. They monitor your online search history, your social media associations, your compliance with health mandates, your physical location data, and your attendance at state-mandated functions.
And what happens if you step out of line?
If your social credit score drops below an acceptable threshold, perhaps because the algorithm detected you attending an unauthorized underground church service, or you posted a dissenting opinion about the beast's policies, the algorithm doesn't send police to your door. It simply updates the smart contract on your CBDC and turns off your digital wallet.
No one may buy or sell.
Yeah.
You are instantly, algorithmically excommunicated from society. You can't buy groceries to feed your kids. You can't pay your rent. You can't purchase fuel for your car. You become a digital non-person, starved into submission without a single bullet being fired.
And what's profound is the theological context the sources provide for this level of technological unity. The theological commentaries connect this impending global control grid directly back to the first book of the Bible, Genesis chapter 11, the story of the Tower of Babel.
The Tower of Babel. Remind us of the details there.
At Babel, humanity was entirely united. They spoke one single language, and they pooled their collective technological and architectural prowess to build a massive tower that reached the heavens. It was a monument to human autonomy, an explicit rebellion against God's command to scatter and fill the earth.
It was pure hubris.
It was. God's response wasn't to destroy them with fire. His response was to confuse their language and disperse them geographically. He effectively instituted a communication barrier to permanently limit their capacity for unified, concentrated evil.
But today, with massive global fiber optic networks spanning the oceans, instant AI-driven translation software, and the ubiquitous nature of the internet, we are essentially reversing the judgment of Babel.
We are entirely reversing Babel. The internet is the new unified language. Binary machine code is a universal tongue understood by computers in Tokyo, London, and New York simultaneously. We are creating a unified, instantaneous, global infrastructure.
They've all connected.
And the philosophical ambition driving it is the same as Babel. Technological transcendence. It's the philosophy of transhumanism, the belief that we can merge our biological identities with digital intelligence to overcome disease, poverty, and perhaps even death. Influential figures at institutions like the World Economic Forum often speak in these soaring, quasi-spiritual terms about the Fourth Industrial Revolution acting as a catalyst to build an earthly utopia, completely independent of any divine intervention.
Okay, let me stop you there and ask a really tough foundational question.
Yeah.
Because as I hear this, my instinct is to just smash my laptop and move to a cabin. Are the sources arguing that technology is inherently evil? Is a biometric scanner at the airport demonic? Is a digital currency inherently satanic? Or is this just a question about who holds the reins of power?
That is a vital, necessary distinction to make, and the ethical sources clarify this beautifully. Technology itself is a morally neutral tool. An algorithm is just mathematics. A digital currency is just lines of code on a server.
Right. It's just a tool.
However, the convergence of these specific technologies,
Yeah.
ubiquitous biometric surveillance, programmable money, algorithmic censorship, and globalized military dominance creates a turnkey infrastructure for absolute tyranny.
A turnkey infrastructure.
Think of it like building a fully loaded, highly sophisticated weapon, chambering around and leaving it on the table in a crowded room. The gun itself might be neutral in its resting state on the table, but human history, human nature, and the explicit warnings of biblical prophecy suggest that eventually someone with malevolent intent is going to walk into the room and pick it up. The future beast doesn't have to invent the global control grid. He just has to walk onto the stage and turn the key that we have already built for him.
That is a phenomenal way to put it. The infrastructure precedes the dictator. But if all this infrastructure is being laid down right now, today, how is it affecting people who are living through the construction phase? We aren't just sitting around waiting for a future dictator to see the impacts of this technology. It's happening in our pockets right now. This leads us to the societal conditioning phase, what the sources call the digital Babylon. How are these digital ecosystems preparing the ground for this kind of unified system?
The sociological and ethical sources introduce this concept of digital Babylon to describe our current civilizational shift, particularly focusing on the youth, the first true generation of digital natives.
Yeah.
Historically, a child's worldview was shaped by three primary institutions: the family, the local school, and the church or religious community.
Sure.
Today, those have been entirely usurped. The primary disciple maker of the modern mind is the algorithm. People live out their days in immersive, highly personalized digital ecosystems driven by AI recommendation engines.
And those engines have an agenda.
Right. We must understand that these engines are not value-neutral librarians. They are optimized for a specific goal, maximizing engagement and screen time. And human psychology dictates that the best way to maximize engagement is by promoting sensationalism, outrage, moral relativism, and a highly secular post-truth worldview.
So they aren't just entertaining us, they are actively conditioning us.
Yes. If you view this through the futurist eschatological lens we discussed earlier, this algorithmic environment acts as a massive preparatory delusion. If a future global leader is going to demand absolute worship and compliance, the global population must be psychologically primed to accept it. They must be slowly conditioned to view absolute objective truth as dangerous or intolerant, and to view technological global unity as the highest possible good.
And a major tool in that conditioning is algorithmic censorship. I've seen this debated endlessly. It's not just about what the TikTok or YouTube algorithm promotes. It's about the content it actively suppresses.
Precisely. The ethical journals in our source stack highlight a disturbing trend where biblical truth, orthodox Christian views on morality, or traditional family structures are increasingly marginalized. Algorithms are often trained by their human creators who possess their own inherent biases, of course, to flag traditional religious viewpoints as hate speech, misinformation, or harmful content.
Which fulfills prophecy too, right?
The theological sources map this directly onto the ancient prophecy found in Isaiah 5:20, which warns, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness." In the modern digital public square, the algorithm acts as the ultimate gatekeeper. It possesses the power to unilaterally redefine what is socially acceptable, effectively silencing dissenting voices not by arresting them, but through shadow banning, deplatforming, and throttling their reach to zero.
It's a soft persecution. It isolates you digitally, which paves the psychological way for the hard, physical persecution of the beast system later. But I'm looking at this from a completely different angle now. Let's pivot to the geopolitics of this for a moment, because it's one thing to build an app that censors people. It's another thing entirely to unite the globe.
That's true.
You mentioned earlier that the beast derives power from a 10-nation confederacy. Look at the real world right now. The European Union can barely agree on fishing quotas and agricultural subsidies without threatening to fracture. The UN is entirely gridlocked. How on earth do the sources justify this massive leap to hyper-coordinated global unity? What causes sovereign nations to suddenly hand over the keys?
That is exactly where the geopolitical and eschatological analyses converge. Sovereign nations do not surrender their power willingly during times of peace and prosperity.
No, they don't.
They surrender power during times of unprecedented existential crisis. And the sources point to a specific massive geopolitical upheaval outlined in the prophecies of Ezekiel 38 and Daniel 7.
What happens in those prophecies?
Ezekiel 38 describes an alliance of nations which eschatologists frequently identify geographically as modern-day Russia, Iran, Turkey, and a coalition of North African nations, often referred to collectively as the Kings of the East and the North. The prophecy states this massive coalition will launch a surprise, overwhelming invasion of Israel.
Okay.
But according to the text, this coalition is supernaturally and utterly defeated upon the mountains of Israel without the intervention of Western armies.
Okay, game that out geopolitically. If the major military powers of the East and North Russia, Iran, their allies are suddenly wiped off the geopolitical chessboard, what happens? That leaves a gaping, unimaginable hole in the global power structure.
It creates the ultimate power vacuum. Think about the collapse of the Soviet Union or the restructuring of the world order at Bretton Woods after World War II, but multiplied by a factor of 10. Global energy markets would collapse, supply chains would shatter, and panic would be absolute.
And someone has to step in.
Nature abhors a vacuum. The sources suggest that a Western 10-nation confederation, perhaps an evolution of NATO, a restructured European Union, or a heavily empowered United Nations World Economic Forum-style entity steps in to fill that massive void. The Antichrist figure doesn't emerge initially as a frothing monster.
Right, he wouldn't get elected that way.
Exactly. He emerges as a brilliant, charismatic peacemaker and economic genius. He rises to head this Western coalition, promising to rebuild the shattered global economy, ensure absolute security, and guarantee that a war of that magnitude never happens again. He leverages the terror of the global crisis to consolidate absolute centralized power.
Wow, okay. We've covered a staggering, almost overwhelming amount of ground today. We've gone from the hermeneutics of ancient apocalyptic texts to the plasma sheaths of hypersonic missiles, the quantum decryption of nuclear subs, the generative AI of the false prophet, and the programmable control grids of CBDCs.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. For you, the listener, whether you're commuting home, sitting at your desk, or folding laundry, this might feel incredibly heavy. When you stack all this architecture together, it can feel like a tidal wave of inevitability. It can induce a sense of fatalism. So what does this all mean for you? If you are a learner trying to navigate this landscape, how do you engage with this without just throwing your hands up in despair?
The sources are remarkably aligned on this point. They do not advocate for fatalism. They provide very practical, grounded guidance for navigating this digital age, particularly aimed at a Christian audience. But the principles are deeply applicable to anyone who values individual liberty, privacy, and objective truth.
Okay, lay them out for us.
They synthesize their recommendations into four main pillars. The first is to avoid the extremes of sensationalism and apathy.
Right, because both extremes paralyze you.
Exactly. Don't fall into the trap of sensationalism. Don't look at every new iPhone update, every new barcode, or every new political treaty and scream, "This is it! It's the mark of the beast." That kind of hypervigilance ruins your intellectual credibility and induces constant, exhausting panic.
It's the boy who cried wolf.
Precisely. But conversely, do not fall into apathy. Don't blindly accept every new convenience technology without rigorously questioning its ethical implications. You must maintain intense critical thinking. When a new system is rolled out, ask yourself, how does this technology affect my privacy? How does it impact my autonomy? And how is it subtly shaping my spiritual and psychological formation?
Keep your eyes wide open, but keep your feet on the ground. What's the second pillar?
The second is to engage in data stewardship. This is a fascinating countercultural point. Rather than retreating to a cabin in the woods, throwing away all your electronics, and yielding the digital space entirely to secular forces, the sources urge believers to actively participate in the development and regulation of artificial intelligence.
Wait, if the algorithm is this manipulative and dangerous, my first instinct is to throw my router in the trash. How do the sources justify staying engaged in a system that is actively hostile to traditional values?
Because AI models are trained on data. They learn from the internet. If Christians and conservatives completely abandon the digital public square, the foundational algorithms of the next century will be trained exclusively by secular, post-truth, or actively hostile worldviews.
I see.
The sources argue that believers have a mandate to be salt and light in the digital realm. That means writing code, engaging in tech ethics boards, producing high-quality digital content, and ensuring that orthodox traditions, biblical ethics, and classical moral values represent a heavy weight in the training data of these emerging systems. You cannot complain about the bias of the machine if you refuse to help program it.
I absolutely love that. Don't abandon the ship, fight for the steering wheel. What is number 3?
Third is spiritual preparedness and intentional discipline. The sources emphasize heavily that while we're discussing technology, this is ultimately a spiritual conflict. You are dealing with digital systems explicitly engineered by thousands of psychologists and coders to bypass your rational mind and hijack your dopamine responses.
They're literally hacking human attention.
Exactly. Therefore, spiritual discipline is the required antidote to algorithmic conditioning. This means practicing digital fasting, intentionally disconnecting from your devices. It means grounding yourself deeply in physical, face-to-face community because the algorithm thrives on your isolation. And it means saturating your mind in ancient texts and prayer, specifically intercessory prayer for the protection of young minds against the subtle, relentless deception of recommendation engines.
You have to deliberately detox your brain so you can remember what baseline reality actually feels like. And the final recommendation.
The fourth is a call for empirical research and advocacy. We cannot simply rely on anecdotes about our posts being hidden. The academic sources call for rigorous, peer-reviewed, data-driven studies on algorithmic bias.
We need actual evidence.
We do. We need to meticulously document, quantify, and expose exactly how religious and conservative content is treated by search engines and social media monopolies. We need hard data to present to policymakers, tech leaders, and courts to forcefully advocate for digital free speech and religious liberty before the infrastructure completely locks down.
Wow. Okay, let's take a breath and recap this unbelievable journey. We started by decoding the complex ancient symbols of the beast, understanding the preterist, historicist, and futurist lenses people use to interpret Revelation. We took that futurist lens and mapped those ancient descriptions of total invincibility onto the terrifying modern reality of hypersonic weapons, laser shields, and the mathematical death of mutually assured destruction.
Right.
We waded into the dark waters of how quantum computing, squishy sensors, and cyber warfare threatened to decapitate nuclear command, creating a hair-trigger world of AI entanglement. We saw how the false prophet's ancient miracles perfectly aligned with the capabilities of deepfakes and orbital weaponry, and how the infamous mark of the beast perfectly mirrors the ultimate economic control system of programmable CBDCs tied to biometric scanners and social credit scores.
And we explored how the convergence of all these technologies is actively laying the psychological groundwork for a digital Babylon, conditioning an entire generation to accept surveillance, algorithmic censorship, and a unified global state.
It is a massive, heavy puzzle to put together. But I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought, drawn directly from the synthesis of all these geopolitical and theological sources we've explored today. We are currently living through a fundamental once-in-a-millennium shift in the very nature of human power. We are witnessing the transition from geographic sovereignty to information sovereignty.
That's a huge shift.
It is. In the past, if a tyrannical empire wanted to conquer your life, they had to physically march an army across your borders, kick down your front door, and occupy your physical territory. But today, the beast system doesn't need to occupy your town. It doesn't need to know your street address. The new empire relies entirely on the global stack of digital identity, instant communication, and centralized finance.
Exactly.
If a regime controls that stack, if they can simply exclude you from the digital ecosystem with the silent flip of an algorithmic switch, turning you into a non-person who cannot buy food, sell labor, communicate with family, or access your own bank account, does physical military resistance even matter anymore? If you have a gun but you can't buy bread, are you free? And most importantly, if we continue to build systems that completely remove the human out of the loop, replacing human conscience, grace, and judgment with cold, calculating, perfectly efficient algorithms, who or what is actually sitting on the throne of our world?
That is the ultimate existential question of our age.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly intense deep dive into the source material. We hope it gave you a new lens to view the headlines. Stay curious, stay intensely critical of the systems around you, and keep exploring. And remember, just because you're looking at a highly technical Pentagon white paper doesn't mean you aren't reading the echoes of an ancient prophecy. Until next time.